All right, episode 8, Chairman of the Boards. And this week we're a chairman down. Grant has made the selfish decision to go to Sydney, Australia, to enjoy what I think it's sort of like a working vacation. So it's not totally just
it's
about
not fully selfish.
So I hope Grant is soaking in the beautiful sun of Sydney, Australia, and we'll continue to hold down the fort in his absence. And I think we got a cool topic today, which is sort of builds on what we had done in the previous episodes, where we had talked about signal path and recommended orders and how you might go about configuring the sequence of your pedals.
Yeah.
But I think almost as important as that is the pedals that you choose. And I think that you and I, Brian, have a unique perspective on this, because most people that are buying pedals and most people that are accumulating pedals to put on their pedal board often are not rig builders. And the things that work well with other effects are not necessarily the things that really performed well when you went to the guitar sanctuary and you played it by itself into an amp and you didn't bring your whole rig with you. Yeah. And I think that this is one really important consideration that, you and Grant and me are all really kind of have a unique perspective in that we see so much stuff. We get to see how these different combinations work. Especially you and Grant probably see all the newest stuff that's coming out.
Yeah.
And you get a sense, I think, pretty quickly, like, wow, this is really great when it's on its own and there's nothing else before or after it. But then as soon as you put it in context, it's like, wow, not as good as it was by itself. And so I think it's important to kind of consider your pedal purchases, knowing that there's going to be 5 or 10 pedals coming after it and 5 or 10 pedals sometimes even coming before it. And how is it going to behave when there's no standards for input impedances, output impedances, all that stuff. So maybe we could use our kind of our rough signal path. If you're watching on YouTube, we can use our rough signal path that we created the last couple of weeks that's diagrammed, and I'll share it on the screen if you're at all curious what that was, or you didn't see it, or you weren't here to make some of the other episodes. You can kind of see our rough signal path here if you're on YouTube. And we're going to kind of be using this as a guide as we kind of go through the different pedals that we recommend, and kind of use this as our North Star today.
Yeah.
So with that said, Brian, is there anything that we should kind of state as a preamble to this before we start making some picks and some recommendations? And these will all the recommendations we talk about, we will categorize them by me and Brian. I'll also get Grant to maybe email us in his recommendations, and we can link all those products in the description of YouTube. We won't be able to link those in the description of the podcast summary. So if you want to see direct links, you'll have to find us on YouTube on the Chairman of the Boards podcast. But anything you want to state before we get into our recommendations here for pedals?
Yeah, so that's the thing, is these are purely our recommendations. These are what we like, what I like. Some things that I like that other people might not like, and that's totally fine. I think a big part is that people take and I'm not saying everyone's advice is wrong, is they'll be like, oh, this person says it's amazing pedal, so it has to be amazing. But you may not like the sound of that pedal to do that tone. So this is purely what we think we like, and we've being at the guitar store, I have a lot of access to that kind of stuff to try out. But I'll say it as I always do, just take the time and try out that stuff that yourself too. Take what we say and kind of go off of that. Let what we kind of suggest be kind of a jump off point for you to figure out. So that's what I would say, personally.
Yeah. Ultimately, in the road to Tone Town, your ears are the best GPS. They're going to guide you. They're going to be the most honest. And you know, it's best to not choose your pedals with your eyes. It's best to choose them with your ears. And even choose your settings with your ears and not your eyes. Some people are like, well, everything has to sound good when it's all at noon, otherwise I don't like it.
Yeah.
But maybe if you just tried, an hour forward, an hour back,
yep,
you would have been in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
So, Brian, why don't you kick us off? If we're starting first, and again referencing sort of the guide that we had come up with from last week, we kind of started with the idea of impedance sensitive pedals, things with germanium or silicon transistors like fuzzes or treble boosters, or I think to a degree, certain vintage wah pedals are very sensitive to things. What are some recommendations that you have in that category? And we can kind of parse it maybe pedal by pedal.
Yeah. So starting off, I'm not like some of these pedals I don't personally use on my board because where I play I don't need the stuff, but I do have some of my favorites from other boards that have come in. So some of these things, some of the things I say, might be on my board, might not. But my first would be, there's actually two, mainly because people bring them in constantly, is the Buddha Wah. I think that's
one. The purple Buddha boudoir.
Yeah,
a la Andy Timmons.
Yes. That was actually the first place that I really saw one, and I was like, okay, this is cool, and was messing with it. There's so many kinds of wahs. They're all really amazing, but they all have their own kind of characteristics. And this one was always to me the no nonsense kind of thing. There's no extra switches on the side.
Nope.
There wasn't all these pots on the side. There was no internal dip switches. It was just you got input, output, and you got power, and that was it. And I was like,
yep.
Oh, I like that.
One foot switch
switch
in the truth. That's it.
That's all you need. So, I mean, there's other companies that have great stuff. They have little mini knobs. I think Exotic has mini volume, different adjustments, and that's where you can really start shaping what it's doing. But yeah, so I would say that would be mine. How about you?
I have a couple that I think are good. I think that if you're going for most reliable, and that is a concern when it comes to wah pedals, because mechanically that technology is maybe at best 50 or 60 years old.
Yeah.
And hasn't really changed very much because of the attitude of guitar players and being so rooted in some of the early music that used guitar pedals.
Yeah.
So I feel like normal wah pedals and their construction leave some things to be desired, and there's just obvious problems as they age. I think the one that's been able to overcome that is the full tone Clyde wahs.
Okay, yeah.
And I know a lot of people's full tone can be a very triggering word, so we'll give a trigger warning. I guess it's too late for a trigger warning. But irrespective of what you think of Mike Fuller as a person, that wah pedal is the most robust wah pedal made by anybody. And if you want a wah that's going to work every night and that's going to sound pretty dang good, I mean, it's got a couple of different modes. If you get the deluxe version, you got the Jimmy, which I think is kind of more of a Vox thing, and then you got the Shaft mode. I forget which one that emulates, and there's another one, and then you have the option to turn on a buffer, or I guess change the output impedance when the pedal's on with their buffer. It doesn't give you a buffer when it's off, but it's just to help do that thing where it drives the line a little bit better if you're using a fuzz after it, so you don't lose the sweep of the wah. Some people really want that feature.
Yeah.
So I would say that is probably the most reliable. I think in terms of stuff that sounds really great, that you can, I'm going to stick more with new stuff, not with vintage stuff.
Yeah.
I think the Custom Audio Electronics wah is really good.
Yes.
That's made by Dunlop. And that's kind of he used to, when I was a kid, and sort of there weren't really a lot of mod options that were publicized.
Yeah.
But everybody who was like a studio guy had a Robert Bradshaw hot rodded crybaby that had, knobs and switches and inductor changes and all that stuff, and basically incorporated all the things that he had been doing for all the session guys, whether it was Landau or Lukather or whoever.
Yeah.
And incorporated it into a product with Dunlop, and it's a really cool wah. It sounds great. It's got a boost. It's got switchable inductors, and it's a really great sounding wah. I really like that one a lot. And I think the exotic one for size purposes, if you're at all guided by how much real estate it takes up, I haven't found that the Dunlop minis are really. I mean, I think that if you need a wah and it's all about size, then of course get a Dunlop mini. I find them a little unusual to use. I can't. I'm sure that they sound pretty good. I haven't actually like compared them side by side with other stuff, but I think the exotic is a good medium between the really small mini wahs and the normal size wahs. I think it's maybe around 8 inches as opposed to 11 or 12 inches, which is the normal wah depth.
Yeah.
And as you said, they have those trim pots for, I think, the Q and the, I think they have one for Q, and then they have EQs and stuff like that on the side. And that sounds really good, and certainly it's got a pedigree of really good players that use it. I think Paul Jackson Jr. uses it on some rigs. I think that John Mayer has been using it. So certainly there's some people behind that one, and I think that one also is very well made. If there was a second to Full Tone in terms of build quality, I'd probably say it was exotic with their particular wah, which they did a custom casting and everything for.
Yeah. I love their stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So from the list,
you want to go to fuzzes next?
Yeah, we could do fuzzes. This is gonna be another one of those. I don't use fuzz personally, but I do have some of my favorites. So the first one would be the first one would be the Jackson Audio, the fuzz. I personally like it because it is a fuzz and it has like an octave. I think what's the term for it? Is it Octavia? There's like an octave switch into it. The cool thing about it is you can also switch out the chips on the inside for different types of fuzzes.
Right, so you can got those kind of modules.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really all-around. I see them on like 75% of the boards I do. Mark Lettieri has one on his board, and a couple other guys. I know that crew really well, and their stuff is always just really, really solid. So I would say that one is definitely one of my favorites, as well as the Brown amplification. I think it's called the T4. It's this fuzz. It's a very simple, very compact fuzz. We were actually just demoing it with another another fuzz the other day, and it's really nice and tight, and it just like I said, I don't use fuzz. It's surprising for me to hear people use fuzz where I play like in worship communities. Yep. Like, oh yeah, I use it, and I'm just like, I don't know how you do it. Like, I use one overdrive. I actually have two overdrives, but I don't stack them. So like it's always interesting to hear how people utilize stuff like that. Yeah. So I would say honestly those are probably. But anything else I recommend, like it's more of like I have some stuff on this like big board back here. For this guy, but like it's an older fuzz that I've actually never fired up. So those are right now probably my two favorites and the most like asked for on a build.
Yeah. So if somebody wants pure vintage fuzz, they want to go old school, they want a fuzz face. I think that for modern pedals, certainly Analog Man is probably one of the first names when it comes to vintage style fuzz recreations, whether you're talking about the Sunface or any of the variations thereof, and obviously there's silicon, there's germanium, there's different versions that you can get from Analog Man. Yeah. I think for the size and what they do, those are pretty great. I think if somebody wants to go like way in the deep end and get something that looks like a 1-to-1 replica of an original fuzz face that has all of the, the same sort of build aspects, and look and aesthetic. I think the Dustin Francis, who has the Ivor fuzz, where he's kind of recreating vintage fuzzes, repaints them, all that stuff. Those are really great. Also, Wes Jeans in Texas near you, he also does a similar thing where he'll kind of recreate
I know
an
Wes.
exact replica of a fuzz face, or even now I think it's gotten into tone benders.
Mm-hmm.
I think that those are really spectacular. And I don't know, I haven't played one of Wes's, so I should name that. But I do know Wes is playing, and he is absolutely insane for any of like the SRV Hendrix fans. He's got, that vibe for sure.
Yeah.
Another one that I think is actually pretty good, also pedal board friendly, is the King Tone one, the Jesse Davey one.
Okay.
That's a pretty great fuzz as well. I think it's just called like fuzz. I don't know if it has any distinction beyond that. That's really nice. And then I'll give one other pick. If you're using a buffer or you're using a wireless, there's two fuzzes that can work really well there. And maybe it doesn't sound the same as your vintage germanium fuzz face, but it's going to be really stable, and it works very well in the context of a rack or a wireless rig where you can't give it a direct guitar signal, which most vintage style fuzzes require. One of them is the FZ series from Boss. So I think there's like an FC2, an FC3. I don't know how many numbers in they are. I don't know about the FZ1W, the Waza one. I think that one's like more tone bendery. Maybe it can accept a buffer. I haven't qualified that one, so I can't speak to the newest Wazacraft version, but all the other subsequent versions were good.
Okay.
Another one is the MXR Classic BC108, and it's a mini pedal, and that has like a little buffer engagement switch on it. And Paul Jackson Jr., the session musician, introduced me to that, and he uses wireless for almost every gig, and he needed something that worked really well, and that was very impressive how good it sounded even when running a buffer into it. And so if you needed something small that would work well with the wireless, that would be my number one pick.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I don't know if we need to go into treble boosters. It's kind of a pretty fringe one.
Yeah.
I don't know there's that many people. How about the next thing on the list is buffers, and I guess we could incorporate input and output buffers into this.
Yeah.
There's not actually as many quality options here as people might think.
Yeah.
One of the things that I don't know if you come across this, but and I apologize if I sound a little stuffy. We definitely have allergies. It's allergy season here, and all the flowers are in full bloom. So I feel like a little bit of a mess.
Oh,
but in terms of buffers, I think that people just think because they have one, it means their job is done. Yeah. I got a Boss TU2. That's got a buffer in it. My work's done here. I don't have to do anything more. And I think that there's a collapsing of the idea that just because you have a buffer means it's a good one. It's just like, oh, well, I have an overdrive. It must be a Klon. Like the logic is not the same. There's certainly a wide variety of buffers, and I'd say for the most part, they're actually not that great. So if you were to talk about maybe some buffers that you think are great for pedalboard rigs, what would be your picks?
I don't mean when I don't just do like a single buffer. 90% of the time, like an interface or something has a buffer in it, like the Goodwood interfacer or their underfacer. I can't read the diagram by this little Mesa buffer.
Oh yeah, the stowaway.
Sometimes I'll use those because we have them in stock. We are like the biggest Mesa dealer in all of Texas or whatever. So like we carry all their stuff. So that is one of my go-tos, especially because it's really small, compact. There are some like, build your own buffers, do this, do that. Like I've never got into the realm of building stuff. I typically will just utilize the stowaway or like the interfacer / underfacer. Occasionally I get you see it right there. The LA Sound, it's like the little, their little junction box also has a buffer. I don't know the specs on it though. So really it's between the stowaway and the Goodwood interfacer and underfacer. Honestly, it's just like, it's either that or we have them in like the switcher. Like if they have a
Yeah.
switcher, like the PBC-10 has 3. So,
Yeah.
and I know the Musicom has them, and the 6 PBC-6, all of them have them. So it kind of
Yep.
just depends. Like I did I did a board. It was all like almost all Boss pedals.
Yeah.
And it sounded great. It really did. And when someone kept talking about like, oh, buffers or this or whatever, and like there wasn't like a massive like tone loss or anything. But I know some of those like have, buffers. So it really just depends on the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in terms of buffers, and I talk about this a lot. If anybody has listened to our YouTube channel or anything like that, I talk about this a lot. So I apologize for those that are already very familiar with this. But basically, what I'm looking for when it comes to a buffer is a very specific specification. And for the most part, there are some contingencies where this wouldn't necessarily be right. But in most cases, it will steer you in the right direction, which is you want a 1 meg input impedance and you want 100 ohm output impedance, or technically as close to 0 on the output impedance as possible, but reasonably 100 to 200 is pretty good. And the reason why we say 1 meg on the input is that that's matching the loading of an ordinary guitar amplifier. Like 99.9% of amplifiers are all 1 meg input impedance for guitar. There's some that maybe are 500K, like old Gibson's amps, but very few people use those. So we're going to kind of exclude that. Now, within that, there are very few pedals internally that meet that specification. A few that come to mind are Strymon meet that specification if they're left in buffered mode or they're left on all the time. That's a good example of a company that has some TC Electronic pedals also have that specification. But for the most part, most pedals don't. So you have to augment with a buffer first and a buffer last. And there's some things like Brian talked about, like the Goodwood Audio underfacer or interfacer that has all those buffers incorporated first and last, that are a great way to sort of not only integrate or create a hub where everything connects, but also provides the buffering for the entire system. Yeah. Another really great one that I talk about all the time is the Mesa Boogie High Wire, which is basically like the stowaway that we had pictured in our diagram, or that Brian mentioned. Those are sort of just individual input or output buffers that you can place around the board, but you need 2 of them to completely insulate a system. Whereas the high wire, everything is incorporated into one unit. So it's just one cohesive input and output buffer in one box. So it's got 4 jacks plus a tuner out. So you can, run your tuner all the time, and it actually has a boost built into it too. Yeah. We also have our own buffer interfaces, which we'll be releasing very soon, that are designed to be either built into the wall of one of our pedal boards. It's already pre-drilled for that, or you can have an individual unit, and those will also meet that spec and have, the isolation transformers and the stereo outs and the wet dry capability, or 4 cable and 5 cable capability. But we're not the only ones in there. Like also Goodwood has stuff that meets that same criteria, and even they have options to be much more custom than what ours offers. So I think it just depends on what you need and whether there's a kind of a prefab package. But I would definitely say no matter what you're doing, you really want to make sure that you're observing that particular specification, because that's going to ensure that you're going to get the best possible results from your buffer.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. How about we go into dynamic pedals? Like we talked about compressors, we talked about octaves, filter style pedals, maybe even certain types of modulation pedals that would come before overdrives. What do you got there?
Yeah. All right. So of the compressors, there's a few that I definitely I go through pedals pretty often of swapping stuff out. And I would say the 2 on my list is the Jackson Audio Bloom. I like that one because it has 6 different types of compression types in there. It's really cool to utilize, plus the MIDI and the EQ and the boost. It's just a really nice all-in-one package. But then again, there's also like the Cali 76. There's also another really great compressor. And time and time again, you see them on boards. You see both of them on the boards. So I would say it's between those 2, and also I also love the Diamond pedals, the comp. which I know they're not making them right now. But those are probably my 3 favorite. I would say it's funny to say 3 favorites, even though you can typically only have 1 on a board. But like those are always my go-to recommendations. So
yeah, I have a couple as well. I think it depends on, if it's truly a pedal board based compressor, and it's not trying to do like a studio type compression. There's certain ones that I just think work better. Like I always think, I've said this before, I think maybe on the podcast, that I view the Cali 76 or an 1176 style compressor as being something that would come after a microphone. So the idea of putting it before overdrive and distortion pedals is sort of the antithesis of what I think of. Okay. But with that said, and I think it's a well-built compressor, and I think it's great, and you could certainly use it downstream, and it could be effective. But I think I like Dynacomps a lot, especially I think the reissues that MXR came out with, the script reissues are really nice. I think they sound really good. And I really love that compressor style, two knobs and the truth. And there's simple. So many hit records that a Dynacomp has been used on. I think that they're amazing. I love the sound, whether we're talking about Andy Summers or we're talking about, anything that Lowell George did live was always a Dynacomp from Little Feat. And I think those are great. I also really like the Demeter Opto Compulator, which also is another 2-knob optical compressor that sounds really, really good. Beautiful sounding compressor. Love that. Another one that I really like, if you want kind of a more intense compression sound, I think is the Wampler Ego compressor. Yeah. And, that is so much a part of the Corey Wong sound, is just the really, really heavily squashed Ego comp. And I think it sounds really good for more intense compression settings. I really like it for that. And also most recently, I just did a video about some pedals that resemble rack units. And one that's really impressive that kind of does the LA2A thing is the RAF Engineering Mirage compressor. And that's also, again, 2 knobs. Everything I've mentioned is all 2 knobs. There's nothing complicated about them. And those sound really beautiful and musical and similar to the classic LA2A compressor. And it's really, they have a miniature version, which I have on one of my boards, and then they have some full-size versions and even a hand-wired version for those that really want to go, full perv with the, all the hand-wired contacts and everything, point to point. They can even do that, and those are all great.
Yeah, I would say with compression, for anyone listening, it's something you have to do your research on, because there's some people that will just put a compressor on the board because everyone has a compressor on the board, and sometimes you don't need a compressor. Like me right now, I do not have a compressor on my board. Sometimes I may throw one on because I need it for that type of sound of that part or something, but like sometimes you don't need it. And like I have a friend, he's like, oh yeah, you have to have a compressor. Okay, can you tell me why I need a compressor? He wasn't telling me I needed one. He's like, I have to have a compressor on this board build. I was like, well, have you used a compressor before? He goes, no, but my friend recommended I get one. I'm like, okay, well, how do you want to use it? He goes, oh, well, just how people use compression. I was like, well, people use compression in all different ways. So like, it kind of depends on, what you're trying to do. So yeah, that's, I would say that's a big one that to kind of like get some good, deep dive into on, how to utilize. Yeah. Going down to like the modulation,
octave or filter pedals. What do you got?
So, I love the Pog, like Pog 2. I don't use, that type of sound a whole lot. That's where like a multi-effect pedal, kind of like the GFI synesthesia, comes into play for those kind of things, because you can do the pre-post like we talked about in the past episode, and utilizing that pre for the octave occasionally, and then change your part or whatever, and it could be a different effect. So I always I'm down to like the Pog series. Pog 2 is great if you have the space and you want different types of presets.
Or if you really got the space, just get a Pog 1.
Oh my gosh, those are man, yeah, that's, if you think the Pog 2 is big, Golly, I don't
Could
want to
be
hear
worse.
complaining. Golly, it's like this pedal. I got
It's
it
the
over
same
here.
size as a Memory Man. It's the same enclosure, I think, as a Memory Man is. The original Memory Man.
I got this thing for a board build.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
G4.
That's a great rotary thing. That's a G4 Korg. That used to be the Joe Bonamassa preferred rotary thing back in the day.
Yeah. So like when I see like the original Pog, I think of like that size. Like it's like that. But yeah, I mean those are really only my my suggestions typically is if you're not using a lot of octave, like if it's only for this one song here and there, I typically recommend maybe utilizing something that can do multiple things, an H9 or a synesthesia, something that you can utilize it for more than just octave for that one song and that one part. And some, I will say some like the H9 stuff, some of their stuff may not sound identical to what a Pog 2 could sound like, but it depends on, how nitty gritty you need to get with that type of tone. So I'm between the H9, the synesthesia, and the Pog. The Nano Micro series are great, or you can, up it with the Pog 2 series.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for like the octave thing, I think Pog is definitely great, especially if we're talking about like CCM music. That's pretty much become the standard for that sort of like polyoctave thing, whether it's a Nano or the Mini or the Pog 2. I think another one though that's great and often gets, well, I mean, I think it depends on the genre of music you're playing, but the Boss OC series is really great. Even the newest stuff is pretty great, where you can isolate your low octave and sort of be able to create almost like a bass following aspect, especially if you're in a more abbreviated context and you need to sort of be able to capture maybe another instrument, even if it's just a duo or a trio, and you need kind of like that low end presence there, and you don't have a bass player. I think the Boss OC series is really great and intuitive and easy to use. And also I think the TC Electronics Sub and Up is also very good, and they have many versions of that. These are all digital, of course. There's also some other great analog octave up, octave down stuff that's made by Fox Rocks. I think it's called, I don't know what it's called. Like I think it's just called the Octave something. Octron. That's what it's called.
Octron. Okay, yeah.
And they have some really cool versions of that where you can choose octave up, octave down. You have a dry blend on all of it that you can also disengage. I think that's a really cool one if you want to stay in the analog realm. Of course, it can't do everything that the Pog can do in terms of kind of those where it can almost sound like an organ or synthesizer kind of thing. But that's a really great one. And this is separate, just so people understand, from like the Jimi Hendrix, like Octavia thing. That would fall into the impedance sensitive realm. And if you wanted a really good one, I think Chicago Iron is probably the best. If you want the OG thing, I think Fulltone also makes some good octave style, like octave fuzz style stuff that you could check out. But I think Brian pretty much summarized. I think Pog is pretty unmatched, and if you're not going Pog, I would say go with the Boss OC, whatever incarnation they're up to now is pretty great. Also, TC Electronic makes some good stuff, but filters I think are next. Like envelope filters, things of that nature. Do you have an opinion, Brian, on some of those that you think are great picks, great sounding, that work in the context of pedal boards very well?
So this is where I actually will go and have a chat with Brian Meter up front, and we'll kind of, as I talk about him, he's picking a product right now.
Yeah, ask him what his favorite envelope filter is.
What is your favorite envelope filter?
What's my favorite envelope?
Yeah, like I'll go up and ask him all the time.
Aguilar Filter Twin.
Aguilar Filtertron.
It sounds like a Neutron.
Filter twin. Aguilar filter twin. Filter twin. Yeah. Sorry, gotta say that 3 times fast. So yeah, there's just some stuff I'll walk up front and be like, hey, so what do you think of this pedal? And he'll be like, oh yeah, no, I would go with this type of option. It's one of those things until I get 90% I get the same type of pedals, of styles in. When I get a board like this one back here where it's like completely different from what I'm used to, I'm like, yes, because I have a little bit more time to kind of mess with those pedals. So yeah, filters and stuff I just don't have a lot of say in. I kind of will, because Brian used to build racks and boards and stuff back in his day. And so I'll refer to, he calls it the old dog method, where he'll be like, I'll ask him something and he'll be like, that's one for old dog, and he'll do a little check mark. So it's fun to kind of get an idea. But yeah, that's what I would say, or he would say.
I haven't tried the Aguilar, so I mean, I presume that its design is primarily for bass, but certainly it could work for guitar.
Yeah.
I think that I don't have a ton of preferences here because I don't use filters very much, but I would say the ones that I think are really awesome for especially for their price point, the Qtron is always a great pick. The Qtron Plus or the standard Qtron are really great by Electro Harmonics, and I know recently there's been some price increases, so they're a little bit more expensive, but historically they were a really great deal for what they offered.
Yeah.
Size wise, they're a little cumbersome, and I think for that, I for something that you're getting a great pedal that's not too big. I really like the Maxon version of the AF9 filter.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is a really great one. It's got sliders. I think the newer one changed the sliders back to knobs, but that's a really great one. And Paul Jackson Jr. used that on a lot of stuff, and that really sounds great. Another filter that I think sounds really fantastic that's digital is, I think it's called the Intelligent Filter by Source Audio.
Okay.
And it's got a couple of different models of filter inside of it. It also can be MIDI programmable if you use the Neuro Hub. And that, even though it's digital, sounds really great. I was doing a sax rig, in fact, for Dave
cool.
Cause, who's a smooth jazz saxophonist. And he has one on the rig he's going to be using with sax, but I was testing it, just with guitar, and I was like, wow, this thing actually sounds like pretty great. And if you hadn't told me that it was a digital effect, I don't know that I would have necessarily picked that out above the way that it sounded. And I think that actually was a surprise, and I thought it sounded really good. It impressed me. And I think for the amount of filter options that it does relative to its size, which is kind of like about the size of a standard MXR pedal, it's pretty impressive.
That's awesome.
Oh, you know what? One other one I'll name.
Yeah.
Analog Man has a really good filter. And I found this out from Eric Krasno, who we did a rig for recently, and he made that thing sound so good. And I mean, it was like, sometimes with filters, they can be very particular, and they need to be in a very sweet spot to get the kind of triggering. And it just seemed like you couldn't get a bad sound out of it no matter where you set it. So I was very impressed with the Analog Man one. I don't know how available. I actually haven't seen that many of them ever, but whatever he did there was really great. It sounded really good.
Yeah, I mean, across the board, I love all of Analog Man's stuff. He makes, that was actually one of the ones I forgot to say. I think he has a compressor.
Oh yeah, he's got his orange squeezer and then the Ross one.
The Ross.
Yeah, so analog. I've heard that he disables his digital kitchen clocks and microwave clocks, and
really,
there's no digital around him. He's that analog.
Interesting.
Don't even put anything digital around him.
Interesting. I did. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's crazy.
It's a great story, no matter whether it's true or not. He doesn't own a computer. No digital.
Oh my gosh. That sounds that's crazy.
Well, there was a certain analog nature in the old days. I don't know if you ever dealt with sending him products, but in the old days, you had to put like a postal money order in like the battery compartment of the pedal that you wanted him to modify.
Oh,
so you had to like go, like I remember being a teenager and sending Analog Man a Tube Screamer so that I could get the silver mod or one of these mods done to a Tube Screamer that I had. And I remember like having to like go to the post office, get a postal money order, like fold it up so it would fit in the battery compartment, and then like that was the instruction to like send it to him.
Yeah.
And so I mean it was old school even by the standards of the early 2000s. So yeah.
I mean I actually had a broken. It wasn't an analog pedal. It was some other pedal. Not analog man. Some other pedal. And I actually reached out because I heard that he could do a repair on it. It was like a hard-mounted PVC like switch. And I was like, I'm not going to do these. These are a disaster. So I asked him, and he's like, yeah, go ahead. Send it to this address. Include the cash in the box. And I was like, is there a PayPal option? And he said, I think at the time he said no. So I'm pretty sure that's still a thing.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, he's very analog after all.
I'm not gonna fight him. He is very brilliant. So moving to the rats, this is purely going off of.
Oh, so we're going to distortion now.
Yeah. Oh, is that the next one? What else? What else is there?
Yeah. No, I think we could. There are some modulations that could go before distortion, but I think we can just cover them. We don't necessarily have to say that they're before or after. We'll just go to modulation in its own categories. Okay, so we're talking about distortions and overdrives.
Yeah, I just got excited. I saw the distortions overdrive section. Distortions. I don't use distortions, but you can't go wrong with a rat. With this, I can't remember what the name of this company is. This one that's in our photo.
I think it's the Proco rats.
Rat,
the OG.
Yeah. Them and also my friend over at 1981. His rat is awesome. I think it's called the DRV. Those are probably my two favorites and most recommended, as they're actually on a couple boards back here and over here. Those for me, are pretty much where I max out at rats. I don't use them, but again,
if you're talking about distortion generally, are there other ones too?
Distortions. Another one would be the Asabi from Jackson Audio, which is based off with Mateos. And distortions. I don't get a lot of distortions. I get more overdrives than I do get distortion requests. I don't think the JHS kilt is considered distortion. I can't quite remember.
We can lump in overdrives as well. Why don't we broaden the horizon, and then that way we can just kind of talk about sort of overdrive, distortion, anything that's providing dirt and or gain. We can kind of lump into this category.
That's fine. Yeah. So personally, for me, I actually like the it's called the Mulholland Drive by Teltronic. Okay. They're over in Australia, actually. I had this years ago as a recommendation from a friend, because a lot of the guys at Hillsong were using them, and I had friends that went there and like, yeah, it's a main overdrive because the company's here. So I got one and I loved it. Had to sell it or whatever, and for some to pay like some debt or something. And I just got one back, and it's like by far my favorite overdrive. It's kind of like a Timmy, but it also has a noise cap on it, so you can really crank it and it still will stay really, really quiet. I actually bought a second one because that's how much I like it, and I actually run the output at noon and the second one for my lead stuff at like 3 o'clock. So I have the same exact settings of the same pedal. I don't stack. So that overdrive is my favorite. I love the JHS Morning Glory, King of Tone, the KTR, those pedals. I have a bunch of those. I actually have the KTR. People are gonna kill me when they hear this. I have a KTR sitting on a shelf at home. Like, I have my computer and my monitors. I have it sitting on top of one of the monitors at home, just hanging out right there because I don't need it right now, so I'm not gonna have it on the board. The thing is that there is a lot of great overdrives out there, like the Brown Protein. Like, there's Cornerstone Effects. They have the Antique pedal, Revival drives. There's so many great pedals out there. Sometimes it can be like overdrive overload because there's just so many options. But I mean, like I said, Jackson Audio has Golden Boy, the Aero. There's just so many really great options. It just kind of all, like, I've been working with our luthier who's getting into electric, and he he needs this type of tone, so we gave our suggestions, but to his ear, he didn't like that tone. He thought it was, too bassy. I'm like, that's fine. Let's try this pedal. So that's the cool thing about overdrives is you just have so many options.
Yeah. It's definitely the analogy that I like to use is it is drinking water from a fire hose. There's so many good options.
So many.
And I think there's certainly a lot of overlap. I mean, even in amongst pedals that you talked about, whether it was the King of Tone or the JHS Morning Glory or the Brown Protein, those all have blues breaker style circuits in at least one side of them, whether they're a multi-pedal or the pedal itself is based on a blues breaker circuit.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of overlap in overdrives in what it is that they do. For distortion pedals, and I'm kind of thinking mainly of like higher gain pedals that are kind of doing more higher gain amp simulations. I think a really great one for high gain is the 5150 overdrive from MXR that's kind of supposed to do some of the Van Halen high gain lead tone stuff, and that works really great into a clean amp and really does resemble closely the 5150 style amplifiers, and I have a version 1 PV 5150, and I've compared the pedal to it, through a Fender amp, and it gets not as good, but it's very close. Another one that I think is really good for that higher gain thing is the Sur Riot and the Sur Eclipse. Those both kind of have like a kind of a hot rodded JCM 800 or kind of Soldano-ish type sound. And the Eclipse has multiple channels, so you can really dial it in, and it has a treble middle bass EQ, I think, on each channel, so you have some flexibility there to really voice it appropriately for your rig.
Yeah.
It's kind of bordering on overdrive, but I think it still fall into distortion. I really like the Marshall Governor and a lot of derivatives of that, whether that's like a JHS Angry Charlie or Andy Timmons. Those are really great kind of higher gain, overdrive or distortion style devices. Yeah. And I think let's see, what else do I like that's higher gain? And I like Rats too. I think Rats can be really really useful. And I even think even to this day the standard Proco stuff that they're putting out is actually really pretty good. Like, of course, if you want to go in the deep end and get like a 1981 DRV pedal, those are great. They're well made, unquestionably. But if you don't want to blow a big part of your budget on one product, I think you can still get the whatever the current iteration of the Proco Rat is, and I think you'll be really happy with the sound, and it's gonna it's gonna deliver what you would expect for a Rat.
Yeah.
For overdrive stuff, I still really like tube screamers, and I know that there's some people that have an aversion to those, but I think for the type of gear that I use, which is primarily Strats and kind of Fender style amps, they work really well for me. I'm not really that picky about the version of the tube screamer that it is. I have all the vintage ones. I have a vintage TS9 and TS10 and TS808, and those are all great, but I also will use a tube screamer mini that's whatever, $79, and I think it still sounds pretty much like the tube screamer. There could be slight little differences, but I feel like I can dial them to sound pretty similar and get what I want in terms of the interactivity of my guitar and my pedals and my amps with it. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say that I require a certain version tube screamer to get the sound. So I really like tube screamers. I think you can even just get a reissue TS9 from Guitar Center or wherever for $99, and you're gonna be on the road to Tone Town if tube screamer's your vibe. I'm just trying to look at what I have here on my, I have my wet dry wet rig here beneath me. Another overdrive that I really like, that I seem to gravitate back to a lot, is and I'm gonna also just stay away from any of the pedals that I manufacture for the purposes of this, just to keep it all above board. I really like the Archer from Rocket, and I have a Klon Centaur, and it's great, and it's not really that pedal board friendly, and I don't have any aversion to actually using it. I'm not afraid to take it out anywhere. It's just it doesn't really fit on a reasonably small size pedal board, and I'm not willing to make the accommodation to take it. So I usually just use the Rocket Archer, and I really like that pedal. I like how it stacks with other stuff. And I kind of stick with that and a tube screamer, and I maybe put one higher gain pedal if I think I might want one, whether that's again the Angry Charlie, or I don't have an Angry Charlie, but I have an original Marshall Governor again, which that is based on. I use those sometimes. I also really like in that realm too, another high gain pedal is the MI Audio Crunch Box. That's also based on a Governor and sounds really good. It is fairly reasonably priced.
Yeah. I can't think of. I will say, I thought about this as we were talking about it. The Duelist was another great, a great one.
Another, I think that's Blues Breaker and Tube Screamer, right?
Yeah.
So you got a lot of Blues Breaker. Brian's DNA is part Blues Breaker.
I'm very much Blues Breaker. Yeah, I do like Tube Screamers. I do. I don't know. I play a White Falcon and a Duo Jet and a Fender Custom Shop Strat. So like between those, like anytime I've had the Tube Screamer, they just didn't react very well. I will say, a Tube Screamer does sound significantly better with a tube amp than it does going through like an ACS1 or Iridium. I find the Blues Breakers, when they're hitting those, they're not as harsh sounding. Right. So that's why I kind of just gravitate towards those pedals.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Another honorable mention, and I did a video on this not too long ago, and it's kind of a weird pedal, is the Providence SOV1. And they have other versions of the SOV, which is the Stampede Overdrive is what the SOV stands for.
Okay.
But the one is just super special, has kind of a weird way that it runs. It runs at plus and minus 18. So it's basically like you have one 18-volt input going to the positive side and another 18 volts going to the negative side. So you basically would need two separate 18-volt power supplies if you were able to power it with DC. So it's got really high headroom comparatively to any other overdrive that you would come across. And it just sounds absolutely incredible. It's the only overdrive pedal that was approved that we know of by Howard Alexander Dumble. It is absolutely amazing. It is very big and not necessarily something that would be pedalboard friendly, but it is amazing sounding. Another one that I didn't mention that I was just thinking about is I really like I like the ODR one by Nobles.
Me too.
It's a nice pedal, but I like that Nordland one because it has a few extra controls and it's designed by the same guy that made the original Nobles, and so it kind of has a few improvements beyond sort of what the original one had. And I have original ones and they're great, but I think the Nordland one is a little better built and has a few extra features, and I really like the way that sounds too. It's kind of, I don't know, kind of a bridge to me between, like if you had a Tube Screamer that didn't work maybe as well with other instruments or amps, I think like the ODR one and those variations kind of have addressed some of the issues that might turn people off to Tube Screamers and how they're kind of EQ'd and maybe the boxiness, and you can kind of dial that out quite a bit on the ODR one. In its derivatives, I really like that pedal quite a bit.
Yeah, they have like some kind of switch in the battery compartment, don't they? That does like on the ODR. I don't know if it's like a newer version of the ODR, but there's some kind of like, I don't know, is it a low cut switch? There's some kind of a switch inside. Yeah, it's some kind of switch on the inside of it that allows you to like do something.
Nice. So we've covered impedance sensitive pedals, wahs, fuzzes. We didn't really talk so much about treble boosters. We talked a little bit about octave fuzzes. We talked about buffers. We talked about compressors, octaves, like in terms of, POGs, Boss, OC, 2, 3, 5. We talked about filter pedals. We talked about distortion and overdrive. Mm-hmm. We're coming up on the hour mark here. I'm wondering if maybe the best course of action is that we pause for today. We've given some good recommendations. We're going to, of course, have all the links to everything that we talked about in terms of our recommendations in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on your favorite podcatcher, you can always go to the Vertex Effects YouTube channel, find this episode, which is episode 8, and you'll have all of our recommendations listed and linked. We'll also get Grant's input since he's in Sydney, Australia right now, and I think it's approximately 12 midnight there, and so he's not joining us today, but we will get his recommendations on these and post those as well. So you'll see like Brian's recommendations, Grant's recommendations, Mason's recommendations, and then we can resume this next week, kind of coming back with like boost and EQ pedals, volume pedals, modulation pedals, delays, reverbs, and we'll have all three of us incorporated for that so that we're able to continue this conversation. You can get our pedal picks in each one of the categories. Is there any final thoughts or things for people to consider before we leave them for this week?
I say it every single time, don't be afraid to try out multiple things. Don't be afraid to go to a guitar store and a local shop and try out that pedal that you've been looking at. You can watch all the YouTube videos you want, but until you try it out, and I even encourage, and some people may be like, oh, that's excessive, but you may have to bring your pedal board with you to the store that you're going. So like here at the Guitar Sanctuary, like I encourage people, like don't bring in your 412 in your head and all sorts of craziness, but like bring in your board, plug in where you think you're going to like it, and play with it through your stuff. Because if it sounds like, I've done this time and time again, I've played through pedals that sound incredible through my guitar, through the pedal, straight to the amp. I take it home, I completely rebuild my board around this pedal, and then it does not sound good. And I do this full time, and it's still annoying to me that I'm like, I gotta take my board apart because it sucks. Like, it just doesn't sound good. So like, don't be afraid to experiment, and don't be afraid to like, hey, friend that has this pedal, if you're not using it, can I try it? Have someone loan it out to you. So yeah, I just say try it with your rig. That's the biggest part.
Yeah. And I think that's really the best advice that we could give anybody, which is don't think that just because it worked great by itself that's going to work great in the context of the pedal board. And I think that there's a lot of new stuff that as guitar players we kind of have like we're like the boy who cried tone, where everybody is evangelizing this thing. Everybody kind of goes to the bright shiny light, and then we're off to the next thing, within weeks or months. And I think that a lot of the recommendations that we made here, it may not be that sexy. These may have not been really groundbreaking recommendations. And there's something to be said, I think, about pedals that have had a lot of longevity that you've seen recurring on a lot of rigs over time, or at least those circuit kind of archetypes, because there is something to be said about stuff that has been around for 10 or 20 years and is still used over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And especially if you look at, rig builds from Brian or Grant or older ones that I did when I was doing this with more regularity, there seems to be a recurring cast of characters that's on those boards, even if they're not the newest, coolest stuff. And it's because they're proven entities, they work great. And so I wouldn't be afraid to go back in time and really look at what's kind of historically worked for people and kind of use that as a reference point, because the pedal world can be a really revolving door. And as somebody who's making pedals, I can say confidently that for every 5 pedals that we release, maybe only 1 or 2 really stick. So for us, like steel string and its variations, that was a concept that stuck. But I've had other pedals like the T-Drive or the Nile compressor, good ideas, didn't stick,
Yeah.
And so, there are certain things that we know work and certain things that we know don't. And I think that going with stuff that's really proven itself time and again and is being used repeatedly, those are good places to consider, even though it may not be the coolest, hippest thing that all the kids are using. So just keep that in mind. Temper yourself.
I agree
Yeah.
completely.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for watching. If you are watching this on YouTube, make sure that you like, you subscribe, you hit the bell icon. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts, be sure to rate this podcast or leave us a review. If you do that on iTunes, that's a huge help to the podcast. You can follow Brian and Grant and me on Instagram. We're going to have all that linked in the description of the YouTube video. And we'll see you next week as we continue in episode 9 and going through our pedal recommendations based on kind of a larger signal path that we had talked about in previous episodes that came right before this. So please do join us next week as we continue this conversation, hopefully with Grant as he either makes his way back from Sydney, Australia, or finds a quiet place where he can have a conversation with us at midnight his time. Thanks, guys, for watching, and Brian, we'll see you next week.
Awesome. See you guys next week.